Some fathers sell daughters for survival. The cruel ones do it for entertainment. The laughter began before Lillian Valecrest understood that her father truly meant to humiliate her. It rolled across the ballroom in low waves beneath the chandeliers of Valecrest Manor, warm with wine and candlelight and the sharp sweetness of late autumn roses. Men in black coats smirked behind crystal glasses. Women covered their mouths with jeweled fans while pretending not to stare. The orchestra near the marble staircase continued to play softly, though even the musicians had begun watching the spectacle unfolding beside the fireplace. Lillian stood perfectly still near the center of the room, one gloved hand resting against the folds of her pale blue gown. Her mother had insisted she wear the old dress from 3 seasons ago because, as Margaret Valecrest had coldly remarked that afternoon, there was no point wasting money on a daughter no one intended to marry. The lace sleeves no longer fit properly around Lillian's wrists. She had noticed the flaw the moment she descended the stairs. So had everyone else. "Look at her," her older sister Vivian murmured loudly enough for the nearest guests to hear. "She looks terrified." "She always looks terrified," someone answered. More laughter followed. Lillian lowered her eyes toward the polished floor. The marble reflected fragments of candlelight beneath her slippers like broken gold scattered across water. She focused on those reflections because they were easier to endure than the faces around her. Her father stood near the fireplace with one arm draped carelessly across the back of a velvet chair. Lord Edgar Valecrest had once been handsome in the arrogant way certain men carried wealth. Time and gambling had thinned him. His silver hair remained carefully combed. His smile had not softened with age. If anything, it had sharpened into something restless and cruel. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, lifting his glass. "Tonight, I offer the greatest bargain in England." A few men chuckled immediately. Others exchanged uneasy glances. Even among aristocrats, there were moments when humiliation became too visible to comfortably enjoy. Lord Valecrest either did not notice or did not care. "My youngest daughter has proven entirely useless to this family." He gestured lazily toward Lillian without looking at her. "No fortune worth mentioning. No social charm. No suitors. Frankly, I have spent more maintaining her than she is worth." The words landed softly. That was what made them worse. Lillian felt dozens of eyes turn toward her at once. Her throat tightened, though her expression did not change. Years earlier, she had learned that visible pain only encouraged certain people. Her mother had taught her that lesson thoroughly. "Edgar," Margaret Valecrest said with a brittle laugh, "do not frighten the guests." "Frighten them?" he repeated. "I am entertaining them." He raised his glass higher. "Come now. Surely someone here has enough coin and enough bravery to take the girl off my hands." The room erupted again. Not loudly this time. The sound was quieter now, edged with discomfort. A young viscount near the windows muttered something under his breath that made his companions snort into their drinks. One older woman looked away entirely. Lillian stood motionless while heat climbed slowly beneath her skin. She became aware of every detail around her with painful clarity. The wax melting down silver candlesticks. The scent of tobacco lingering near the curtains. The weight of her necklace against her throat. Somewhere outside, beyond the towering windows, rain tapped softly against the dark grounds surrounding the estate. Vivian crossed the room with elegant confidence and slipped her arm through their father's. Her crimson satin gown shimmered beneath the chandeliers. "Perhaps you should pay someone to take her," she said sweetly. More laughter. Lillian inhaled once. Slowly. She had known humiliation before. Quiet humiliations. Lingering ones. The kind that unfolded over years instead of moments. She had learned to survive them the way people survived winters, by enduring them until they passed. But this felt different. This was public. Deliberate. Her father was not simply mocking her. He was displaying her. She turned slightly toward the staircase, thinking only of escape. If she moved carefully enough, perhaps no one would notice her leaving. £20. A drunken baron called from the back of the room. "That is generous," another man replied. "You would lose money by morning." A fresh wave of amusement spread through the guests. Lillian's fingers tightened around the fabric of her skirt until the material trembled faintly beneath her hand. Her father laughed harder than anyone. £20, he repeated. Do I hear more? Someone near the orchestra offered 30. Another voice suggested 40 along with a horse. Vivian nearly doubled over laughing into her fan. Margaret Valecrest looked mildly irritated now, though not because of her daughter's humiliation. Only because the spectacle threatened to become vulgar. Lillian took one step backward, then another. She no longer heard the bids clearly. The room had become strangely distant around her, as though she were standing underwater while voices echoed somewhere far above. Her pulse stumbled unevenly inside her chest. She fixed her attention on the staircase again. Only 20 feet away. She could leave quietly. No one would stop her. £50. A man called carelessly. Dear God, another answered. You are overpaying. Her father lifted his glass toward the crowd with theatrical delight. Surely my daughter inspires greater enthusiasm than that. Then the ballroom doors opened. The sound itself was small, barely noticeable beneath the music and conversation. Yet the room changed immediately. Conversations faltered first, then stopped altogether. Lillian did not turn at once. She only felt it, the shift in air, the sudden stillness spreading outward through the ballroom like frost across glass. Her father's smile faded slightly. A footman near the entrance straightened so abruptly, he nearly dropped the silver tray in his hands. Lillian looked up. A man stood beneath the archway of the ballroom entrance, tall and motionless in a black evening coat still damp from rain. Water glimmered faintly along the shoulders of dark wool. He removed his gloves slowly, one finger at a time, while surveying the room with a calm expression that revealed absolutely nothing. Theodore Ravenshade, Duke of Blackmere. Even before anyone spoke his name, the room recognized him. Power announced itself differently in certain men. Not loudly, never loudly. It appeared in silence, in the instinctive way people moved aside without being told. Theodore stepped forward across the marble floor with measured precision. The orchestra stopped playing entirely now. No one seemed brave enough to resume. Lillian had seen the Duke only twice before from a distance. Once at a winter charity gala in Boston 3 years ago. Once at St. Bartholomew Cathedral during a funeral attended by half the East Coast elite. He had frightened her both times without ever speaking. Not because he was cruel, because he looked like a man entirely incapable of being controlled. His hair was black, touched faintly with silver near the temples despite his relatively young age. His face carried the cold composure of old marble statues carved for kings. His eyes moved briefly across the ballroom before settling on Lord Valecrest. Your Grace, Edgar Valecrest said quickly, forcing a smile back onto his face. What an unexpected honor. Theodore said nothing. He removed his rain-dark gloves completely and handed them to a servant without looking away from Lillian's father. The silence stretched long enough for discomfort to begin crawling visibly across the room. Finally, Theodore spoke. His voice was low, calm. What price did you place on your daughter? No one moved. Lord Valecrest laughed weakly. Surely you understand this is only a joke. Theodore's gaze did not change. I asked a question. Lillian felt her breath catch unexpectedly. Something about the Duke's stillness unsettled her more than anger would have. Angry men shouted. Angry men lost control. Theodore Ravenshade looked entirely controlled. Her father cleared his throat. The guests were amusing themselves. Nothing serious. How much? Theodore repeated. The rain continued tapping softly against the windows. Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a woman set down her champagne glass too quickly. The crystal clinked sharply against silver. Lord Valecrest attempted another smile. It looked strained now. £100, then. A few nervous chuckles followed. No one else laughed. Theodore reached inside his coat and withdrew a leather checkbook. He did not hesitate. He did not negotiate. He simply wrote. The scratching of pen against paper sounded impossibly loud in the silent ballroom. Then he tore out the check and handed it to Lord Valecrest. $1,000, Theodore said. I believe that exceeds your asking price. Lillian's pulse stopped for one terrible second. Her father stared at the check in open disbelief. Several guests inhaled sharply. Vivian's smile vanished entirely. Your Grace, Margaret Valecrest whispered. Surely this is unnecessary. Theodore finally looked toward Lillian. Not at her dress. Not at the floor. At her. Directly. The full force of his attention settled over her so suddenly that her fingers loosened from her skirt without her realizing it. His expression did not soften, but something cold and deliberate moved beneath it. Something that felt older than the room itself. No, he said quietly. It is overdue. No one in the ballroom seemed capable of breathing after that. Lord Edgar Valecrest stared down at the check in his trembling hand as though the ink itself had insulted him. $1,000. The amount was absurd. More than absurd. It was enough money to repair the eastern wing of the estate that had remained closed for nearly 6 years after storm damage. Enough to erase 3 separate gambling debts whispered about behind drawing-room doors from New York to Newport. Enough to transform humiliation into desperation almost instantly. Lillian watched the exact moment greed overtook her father's pride. It passed across his face in a quick, ugly flicker. His spine straightened. His fingers tightened around the paper. The mocking amusement vanished from his expression entirely. Your Grace, he said again, softer now. This is extraordinarily generous. Theodore Ravenshade did not answer. He remained standing near the center of the ballroom with rainwater still darkening the shoulders of his coat. The candlelight sharpened the angles of his face into something severe and unreadable. Around him, guests stood frozen in uneasy silence. No one understood what had just happened. More importantly, no one understood why. Lillian became aware that Theodore had not looked away from her once. Not since speaking those final words. The attention unsettled her. Men usually avoided looking at her directly at social functions. They looked through her, around her, past her toward Vivian or toward wealthier women with brighter smiles and louder laughter. Theodore looked at her as though she were the only person in the room worth noticing. The sensation made her pulse unsteady. Well, Edgar Valecrest said abruptly, attempting a laugh that sounded painfully forced. I suppose a gentleman honors an agreement. Margaret Valecrest stepped closer immediately. Her jeweled bracelets chimed softly against one another. Surely there is no need for dramatics, she murmured. Lillian is not actually. Mother. Vivian's voice cut through hers quietly. $1,000. Margaret fell silent. Lillian watched her mother's eyes lower toward the check. Watched calculation replace embarrassment with frightening speed. The transformation felt colder than the humiliation itself. Theodore finally moved. Only one step. Yet the room instinctively shifted backward around him. Miss Valecrest leaves with me tonight, he said calmly. A sharp silence followed. Lillian felt every heartbeat distinctly beneath her ribs. Her father recovered first. Of course, naturally, though perhaps arrangements should be discussed privately. Theodore's expression did not change. There is nothing to discuss. The orchestra remained motionless near the balcony. One violinist still held his bow suspended awkwardly in the air, too uncertain to lower it. Near the windows, several guests had begun whispering quietly behind gloved hands. The words drifted faintly through the ballroom. Bought her. Did you hear him? Blackmere never attends social gatherings. Why her? Lillian lowered her gaze toward the marble floor again. Heat climbed slowly beneath her skin. She should have spoken. She understood that. A respectable woman did not stand silently while men arranged her future around her like furniture being transferred between estates. Yet her voice refused to emerge. The entire evening felt unreal now. Distorted. Only 20 minutes earlier she had been preparing to slip quietly upstairs unnoticed. Now the most feared duke on the East Coast had purchased her freedom in front of half of New York society. Lillian. Her father's tone sharpened slightly. She looked up. Thank his grace. The words lodged briefly in her throat. Theodore still watched her with that same unreadable steadiness. No triumph, no cruelty, nothing visible at all. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said quietly. Theodore inclined his head once. A small movement, precise. "You may collect whatever belongings you require," he said. "My carriage leaves in 20 minutes. 20 minutes. The number echoed strangely inside her mind. 20 minutes to leave the only home she had ever known. Even if that home had never truly wanted her. Margaret Valecrest forced another brittle smile. Surely Miss Valecrest should return tomorrow after proper preparations. "No," Theodore answered. One word. Nothing more. Yet the finality in his voice closed the conversation instantly. Lillian saw her mother stiffen almost imperceptibly. People often mistook Theodore Ravenshade's calmness for politeness during the first few moments of meeting him. Then they realized something far more dangerous hid beneath it. He was not requesting cooperation. He expected it. "Very well," Edgar muttered. Theodore reached for neither champagne nor conversation. He simply turned slightly toward the nearest servant. "Inform my driver we will depart shortly." "Yes, Your Grace." The footman nearly bowed twice in his haste to obey. Lillian became suddenly aware that her hands were cold. Very cold. She pressed them together carefully to stop the faint trembling beginning in her fingers. Theodore noticed. She knew he noticed because his eyes dropped briefly toward her clasped hands before returning to her face again. "Miss Valecrest." His voice lowered slightly. "Do you require assistance upstairs?" The question startled her because it was the first thing anyone had asked her all evening instead of deciding for her. "No," she answered quickly. "I can manage." Another slight nod. 20 minutes, he repeated. Then he stepped aside. Not toward the guests. Not toward her family. Toward the windows overlooking the rain-dark gardens beyond the estate. He stood there in complete silence with one hand behind his back while servants hurried nervously around the ballroom pretending not to stare at him. The guests began speaking again almost immediately, though now in hushed frantic whispers. The entire atmosphere of the evening had shifted. Earlier the room had been entertained. Now it was afraid. Lillian turned toward the staircase slowly. Vivian caught her arm before she reached the first step. Her sister's nails pressed sharply through the thin fabric covering Lillian's wrist. "What did you do?" she whispered. Lillian blinked once. "Nothing. Men like Theodore Ravensshade do not spend $1,000 on nothing." Vivian's perfect composure had cracked slightly now. Jealousy moved beneath her voice like poison beneath clear water. He barely looked at anyone for years. He rejected invitations from families twice wealthier than ours. Lillian gently pulled her wrist free. "I do not know him." Vivian studied her face carefully as though searching for evidence of deception. "No," she murmured at last. "That is the frightening part." Upstairs, the second-floor hallway remained dim and quiet compared to the glittering chaos below. Lillian closed her bedroom door behind her and stood motionless for several seconds. The silence rang painfully in her ears after the noise of the ballroom. Rain slid softly against the windows overlooking the eastern lawn. Her room looked exactly as it had that morning. Small, neat, temporary. The wallpaper near the ceiling had begun peeling during the previous winter. One drawer in her vanity refused to close properly unless pushed twice. Her mother had promised repairs months ago. They had never come. Lillian crossed slowly toward the wardrobe and opened it. Very little inside belonged truly to her. 3 dresses, 2 winter coats, several books hidden beneath folded shawls because Margaret disliked seeing women read at meals. A small porcelain horse from childhood with 1 broken ear. Nothing else. She reached for the blue traveling case stored beneath the bed and paused suddenly. Her reflection stared back at her faintly through the dark window glass. Pale face, loose brown curls already falling from their pins. Eyes still wide with disbelief. "Miss Valecrest leaves with me tonight." The sentence replayed again inside her mind. Not cruel. Not kind. Certain. A strange sensation settled slowly across her chest then. Not relief exactly. Relief implied safety. She was not foolish enough to believe safety waited for her at Blackmere Hall beside a man like Theodore Ravenshade. But for the first time in years, something inside her life had changed direction completely. The realization frightened her more than the ballroom ever had. A knock sounded softly against the bedroom door. Lillian turned sharply. Yes. The door opened halfway. Margaret Valecrest entered without waiting for permission. Her mother closed the door carefully behind herself before speaking. You will behave properly once you arrive there. Lillian stared quietly at her. Margaret crossed toward the vanity, adjusting one diamond bracelet absently. Do not embarrass this family further. Further. The word landed strangely after everything that had happened downstairs. Mother, Lillian said softly. Father tried to sell me in front of your guests. Margaret's fingers paused briefly against the bracelet clasp. Only briefly. Your father drinks too much when investors are present. Was it a joke? Margaret looked toward the rain-covered windows instead of her daughter. Men like Theodore Ravenshade do not involve themselves in jokes. Lillian felt a chill move slowly down her spine. Her mother finally faced her again. As though everyone inside understood something irreversible had happened beneath the chandeliers upstairs. Two footmen stood rigidly beside the open front doors while cold air swept through the marble entrance hall. Beyond them, Blackmere's carriage waited beneath the rain, with 4 black horses standing perfectly still against the storm. Their dark coats gleamed beneath the lantern light. The carriage itself carried no family crest on its doors. No gold trim. No decorative excess. It looked severe. Expensive in the quiet way only very old money ever achieved. Theodore Ravenshade stood near the bottom of the staircase with one gloved hand resting lightly behind his back. He had not returned to the ballroom. He had not touched the champagne placed near him by nervous servants. He simply waited. The moment Lillian stepped into view, his eyes lifted toward her immediately. Not toward the suitcase. Toward her. Always toward her. The realization unsettled her more each time she noticed it. Edgar Valecrest appeared beside the fireplace, still clutching the check as though afraid someone might reclaim it. There she is, he announced too brightly. Ready at last. Lillian descended carefully, one hand brushing the polished banister. Her blue traveling dress was plain compared to the gowns still drifting through the ballroom upstairs. But she had changed quickly because rainwater would ruin silk within minutes. Several loose curls framed her face now after escaping their pins. She became painfully aware of them the closer she moved toward Theodore. Your Grace, Edgar said eagerly. If there are legal arrangements or future settlements to discuss, I am available tomorrow afternoon. Theodore did not look at him. There will be no further discussions. Edgar's smile faltered again. Naturally. Of course. Margaret Valecrest remained near the drawing-room entrance with her arms folded tightly across her waist. She had not embraced Lillian. She had not offered advice. She merely watched with a strained expression that looked dangerously close to fear. Vivian stood beside her in crimson satin, pale now beneath the candlelight. Lillian noticed her sister staring openly at Theodore instead of at the check still clutched in their father's hand. Not admiration. Calculation. You are fortunate, Vivian said suddenly. The words sounded almost sharp enough to cut. Lillian paused halfway across the hall. Am I? Vivian's lips parted slightly as though she had not expected an answer. Theodore shifted his attention toward her then. Only briefly, yet the movement alone silenced the room. Miss Valecrest, he said calmly. The carriage is prepared. Lillian nodded once. She tightened her grip on the traveling case and moved toward the doors. One of the footmen reached automatically for her luggage, but Theodore spoke before the servant could touch it. Leave it. The servant froze immediately. Yes, Your Grace. Lillian glanced toward Theodore in surprise. I can carry it, she said quietly. I know, he answered. Something about the response lingered strangely between them. Not dismissive. Not mocking. Simple fact. Outside, rain struck the stone steps in silver sheets while the wind carried the scent of wet earth and pine through the dark grounds. Theodore stepped beside her as they crossed toward the carriage. He did not offer his arm. He did not rush her. He simply matched her pace precisely while servants held lanterns above them against the storm. The gravel path glistened black beneath the rain. Lillian felt dozens of eyes watching from the manor windows behind them. Society would talk about this night for months, perhaps years. She imagined the whispers already spreading through drawing rooms across the city. The forgotten daughter. The silent duke. The price no one understood. Theodore opened the carriage door himself. The gesture startled not only Lillian but the servants nearby. Men like Theodore Ravenshade did not usually perform tasks personally, especially not for women considered socially insignificant. "Thank you," Lillian murmured. He inclined his head once. "Watch the step." She climbed carefully into the carriage while rain drummed heavily across the roof above them. The interior smelled faintly of cedarwood and cold leather. Soft lantern light glowed from brass fixtures near the corners, illuminating dark velvet seats and polished walnut panels. Everything inside felt quiet, controlled, immaculate. Theodore entered moments later and closed the door firmly behind them. Outside, one of the drivers called sharply to the horses. The carriage lurched forward through the storm. Lillian folded her hands tightly in her lap while the manor slowly disappeared behind rain-covered glass. She watched the lights grow smaller across the dark hillside until they vanished entirely into mist. No one spoke for several minutes. The only sounds came from the steady rhythm of horses moving across wet roads and the soft creaking of leather beneath shifting lantern light. Theodore sat across from her with one arm resting lightly against the seat beside him. His posture remained perfectly composed despite the rough weather outside. Water still darkened the edges of his coat collar where rain had touched it earlier. Lillian became aware that she had never before been alone with a man outside her family. Certainly not one like him. Her pulse remained frustratingly uneven. "You did not have to do that," she said finally. Theodore looked toward her. "Do what? Tonight?" His gaze rested on her face steadily. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I did." The answer settled heavily between them. Lillian lowered her eyes briefly toward the window beside her. Rain streaked the glass in blurred silver lines while distant trees moved like shadows through the storm. "Why?" she asked softly. Theodore was silent long enough that she wondered whether he intended to answer at all. Then he said, "Because they should not have treated you that way." The simplicity of the statement caught her off guard more than elaborate explanations would have. Not because it sounded romantic. It did not. It sounded factual. Coldly factual. Like a man identifying something unacceptable and correcting it. "Most people ignored it," she admitted quietly. "Most people ignore many things." His voice remained calm. "That does not make them acceptable." Lillian studied him carefully in the dim carriage light. Theodore Ravenshade did not resemble the men she had grown up around. Wealthy men usually performed charm constantly. They smiled too quickly, laughed too loudly, sought approval in every room they entered. Theodore seemed entirely untouched by the opinions of others. The realization made him difficult to understand. "You frightened my mother," she said before thinking better of it. Something almost invisible shifted near his eyes then. Not amusement exactly. Closer to recognition. "Your mother is an intelligent woman." Another silence followed. The carriage wheels struck uneven stone briefly before smoothing again as they moved farther from the estate roads. Lillian became aware that the farther they traveled from Valecrest Manor, the lighter her chest felt. Not happier, simply lighter, as though something crushing had loosened slightly without her noticing. Theodore reached toward the seat beside him then and lifted a folded wool blanket. "You are cold." Before she could protest, he placed it gently beside her instead of directly over her shoulders. The restraint of the gesture unsettled her almost more than physical contact would have. "Thank you," she whispered again. Theodore nodded once and looked toward the rain-dark window across from him. His profile remained sharp beneath the lantern glow. Controlled. Remote. Yet she remembered the exact way his voice had sounded downstairs when he said the humiliation was overdue. Not angry. Certain. "Your family will attempt contact within the week," he said suddenly. Lillian blinked. Probably. You are under no obligation to respond. Her fingers tightened slightly against the blanket resting beside her. You speak as though this arrangement is permanent. Theodore turned toward her slowly. The lantern light caught briefly in his gray eyes. It is. The carriage seemed to grow quieter after that. Outside, rain continued hammering steadily against the roof while dark forests passed beyond the windows in blurred shadows. Lillian stared at him for several long seconds, trying to determine whether she had misunderstood. Permanent, she repeated carefully. You hardly know me. Theodore held her gaze without hesitation. That is not true. Her breath caught softly. Something cold moved slowly through her chest then. Not fear exactly. Something deeper. What does that mean? She asked. Theodore studied her in silence for a moment too long. Then the carriage rolled beneath a flash of distant lightning, illuminating his face in brief silver light. You will understand soon enough, he said quietly. And for the first time since leaving Valecrest Manor, Lillian truly began to feel afraid. Lillian did not sleep for the remainder of the journey. The carriage continued north through the storm while darkness pressed heavily against the windows on every side. Theodore spoke little after his final statement. In truth, he barely moved at all. He sat across from her beneath the dim lantern glow with the same unnerving stillness he carried everywhere, as though motion itself were something he used only when necessary. Lillian tried several times to close her eyes. Each attempt lasted only moments before her thoughts returned sharply to the same sentence. That is not true. You will understand soon enough. Outside, rain lashed endlessly against the roof while black pine forests rolled past beyond the glass like shadows moving through deeper shadows. Sometime after midnight, the storm finally weakened. The rhythmic drumming softened into occasional taps against the carriage windows. Theodore glanced briefly outside before reaching toward the leather strap near the door and pulling it once. Somewhere ahead, the driver responded immediately with a sharp call to the horses. The carriage slowed. We are stopping? Lillian asked quietly. For 10 minutes. Theodore adjusted one cuff with precise calmness. The horses need water. The carriage rolled beneath a large iron archway moments later before coming to a gradual stop beside a stone building lit by 2 lanterns near the entrance. Lillian peered through the rain-streaked window. A roadside inn. Small. Isolated. Its wooden sign creaked softly in the wind while pale yellow light glowed behind frosted windows. Theodore opened the carriage door first and stepped down into the cold night air. One of the drivers hurried forward with an umbrella, though Theodore ignored it entirely. He turned instead toward the carriage and extended one gloved hand upward toward Lillian without speaking. She hesitated only briefly before placing her fingers against his. The contact startled her. His hand was warm despite the cold. Steady. He helped her down carefully onto the wet gravel below before releasing her immediately. No lingering touch. No unnecessary closeness. Everything about Theodore Ravenshade seemed governed by exact control. The innkeeper appeared at the entrance almost instantly after recognizing their arrival. He hurried down the steps, breath visible in the cold air. Your Grace, the man said nervously. We were not expecting. Coffee, Theodore interrupted calmly, and fresh water for the horses. Right away, sir. The innkeeper nearly stumbled over himself rushing back inside. Lillian pulled her coat slightly tighter around herself while wind brushed loose curls across her cheeks. The road behind them stretched dark and empty beneath low clouds. No other carriages moved through the storm. Theodore noticed her shiver. Of course he noticed. He seemed to notice everything. Inside, he said quietly. The inn was nearly empty at that hour. Only one older couple sat near the far fireplace speaking softly over untouched cups of tea. They both fell silent the moment Theodore entered beside Lillian. Not curious silence. Recognizing silence. The kind people reserved for men powerful enough to alter lives with a sentence. Warmth drifted through the small room from the stone hearth near the wall. Lillian realized suddenly how cold her hands had become during the journey. Theodore removed his gloves slowly while the innkeeper himself rushed to prepare a table near the fire. "This way, Your Grace." Theodore nodded once and motioned lightly toward the chair opposite him. Lillian sat carefully. The firelight softened the hard lines of the room, turning polished wood amber beneath flickering shadows. For the first time since leaving Valecrest Manor, exhaustion began pressing heavily against her shoulders. Theodore remained standing for another moment before removing his coat and placing it across the back of his chair. Even that simple movement carried restraint, deliberate efficiency. He sat across from her while servants hurried nervously nearby preparing coffee neither of them had requested twice. Lillian studied the fire instead of him. "You are wondering whether you should run." Theodore's voice came without warning. Her eyes lifted immediately toward him. He watched her steadily across the small table. "I beg your pardon? You have considered it 3 times since leaving the carriage." Heat climbed faintly beneath her skin. The embarrassing part was that he was correct. Theodore folded his gloves neatly beside his untouched cup. "You looked at the door when we arrived, then at the road, then at the stable behind the inn." Lillian tightened her fingers together beneath the table. "I do not even know where Blackmere Hall is." "Massachusetts. That is not close." "No." A servant placed fresh coffee before them and hurried away almost immediately. Theodore waited until the young man disappeared fully behind the kitchen door before speaking again. "You are free to leave if you wish." Lillian stared at him. The words felt impossible after everything that had happened. "Free?" Theodore reached calmly for his coffee. "I purchased your freedom from your family, not ownership of your choices." The fire cracked softly between them. Lillian lowered her eyes toward the steam rising from her cup. Something tightened painfully beneath her ribs, then loosened again almost immediately. "You used the word permanent." Theodore said nothing. People do not usually describe temporary arrangements that way. "This is not temporary." "Then what is it?" Theodore studied her quietly for several seconds. Long enough that she became aware once again of how intensely he observed people. Not casually. Completely. "Protection," he said at last. The answer only deepened her confusion. "From what?" Theodore's fingers paused briefly against the porcelain cup. It lasted less than a second. Yet she noticed it immediately because everything else about him remained so controlled. "You will understand soon enough," he repeated. Frustration flickered faintly across her chest now beneath the fear and exhaustion. "You keep saying that. Because it is true. You speak as though everyone else already knows something except me." Theodore looked toward the fire briefly before answering. "Not everyone." The innkeeper approached cautiously then with a small tray of bread and butter. His nervous eyes shifted repeatedly between Theodore and Lillian while arranging the plates. "Will there be anything else, Your Grace?" Theodore glanced toward Lillian first. Another strange detail. Most powerful men answered for women automatically. "Miss Valecrest." Lillian realized the innkeeper was waiting. "No, thank you." Theodore inclined his head slightly toward the man. "That will be all." Once the innkeeper retreated again, silence settled back over the table. Lillian reached finally for the coffee cup resting before her. The warmth spread slowly through her cold fingers. Outside the window beside Theodore, rain continued falling softly against the dark road. "You said my family would contact me within the week," she said after a while. "Yes. How can you know that already?" Theodore's expression remained unreadable. "Because men who value money above dignity rarely stop after receiving it once." Lillian looked down into her coffee. The statement should have hurt. Instead it simply sounded accurate. Theodore watched her quietly across the firelight. "You are not surprised." She gave a faint, humorless smile. "No." Something shifted near his eyes again then. Not pity. Theodore Ravenshade did not look like a man who pitied anyone. It resembled anger more closely. Controlled anger. The kind buried beneath layers of discipline. "Did they often treat you this way?" he asked. Lillian hesitated. Years of habit urged immediate denial. "Fine. Everything is fine." She almost said it automatically. Then she remembered there was no reason to protect her family anymore. "Not publicly, she answered softly. Theodore's jaw tightened almost invisibly. I see. The fire snapped sharply inside the hearth. Neither of them moved. You are very calm about all of this, Lillian said after another long silence. Theodore lifted his eyes toward her again. No, he said quietly. I am being careful. Her breath caught slightly. Something about the answer unsettled her more than anything else he had said that evening. Because for the first time since meeting him, she heard strain beneath the control. Very faint, but unmistakable. Lillian looked at him more carefully then. The sharp line of his shoulders beneath the dark vest. The exhaustion hidden around his eyes. The tension in his hands whenever conversation drifted too near certain subjects. A strange thought moved slowly through her mind. Theodore Ravenshade looked less like a man celebrating victory and more like someone terrified of losing something again. The realization lingered heavily between them. Theodore seemed to recognize the exact moment she noticed because his expression closed almost immediately afterward. The walls returned. Perfect control. We should continue before dawn, he said calmly. He stood before she could respond. Outside, the drivers were already preparing the horses again beneath the fading rain, while cold wind moved through the dark pines surrounding the inn. Theodore helped her into the carriage once more with the same restrained precision as before. But this time, when their hands touched briefly beneath the lantern light, Lillian noticed something she had missed earlier. His fingers tightened around hers for one fraction of a second too long, as though confirming she was truly there. Dawn arrived slowly through layers of gray mist and fading rain. Lillian first noticed the change in light along the carriage windows sometime after 5 in the morning, when darkness began loosening its hold over the road outside. The storm had finally passed during the final hours before sunrise, leaving behind wet forests, silver fog drifting between pine trees, and long stretches of empty country roads shining beneath the pale sky. She had not realized she drifted asleep briefly until the carriage rolled across uneven stone and startled her awake again. Her head lifted immediately. Theodore sat across from her exactly as before, awake, motionless, watching the passing landscape beyond the glass with one hand resting against the leather seat beside him. The lanterns inside the carriage had burned low now, their soft amber glow nearly overtaken by the cold blue light of morning. Lillian straightened slightly, embarrassed. I apologize. Theodore turned toward her. For what? I fell asleep. You were exhausted. His voice carried the same calm steadiness as always, though fatigue shadowed his features more visibly now beneath the early morning light. Lillian brushed loose strands of hair back from her face and glanced toward the windows. Endless forest stretched outside beneath drifting fog. How much farther? Less than an hour. The answer tightened something unexpectedly inside her chest. Less than an hour until Blackmere Hall. Less than an hour until whatever future Theodore Ravenshade had decided for her truly began. The carriage continued climbing gradually through winding mountain roads bordered by towering pines darkened by rain. Occasionally the fog parted enough to reveal steep cliffs dropping into distant valleys below. Lillian pressed her fingers lightly against the edge of the seat as the wheels rounded another narrow curve. Theodore noticed immediately. You dislike heights. It was not a question. She glanced toward him in surprise. How do you know that? Theodore looked back toward the fog-covered mountains outside. You stop breathing near sharp turns. Lillian stared at him quietly. Another observation. Another detail he should not have noticed so easily. You watch people very carefully, she murmured. Theodore said nothing to that. The silence itself felt like confirmation. A few minutes later the carriage passed through enormous iron gates standing open between two stone pillars nearly 20 feet tall. Lillian straightened instinctively. The gates carried no decorative gold or carved angels like many aristocratic estates. Only a single crest worked into black iron. A raven surrounded by thorned branches. Severe, elegant, unmistakable. Blackmere. Beyond the gates, the road stretched forward through towering pine forests for nearly half a mile. Mist drifted low across the ground while massive lanterns lined the stone path at measured intervals. Every detail felt deliberate, controlled. The farther they traveled into the estate, the quieter the world became. Even the horses seemed to slow naturally beneath the weight of the silence surrounding the property. Then Lillian saw the manor itself. Her breath stopped softly. Blackmere Hall rose from the mountainside ahead like something carved directly from the storm clouds above it. Massive gray stone walls towered over the cliffs, overlooking a dark lake below. Tall windows reflected the pale dawn in long silver streaks, while ivy climbed portions of the eastern towers despite the cold season. The estate looked ancient, not merely wealthy, old enough to feel permanent. The carriage rolled beneath a covered entrance supported by towering stone columns. Before the wheels fully stopped, the front doors of the manor opened. Staff emerged immediately into the cold morning air. Not chaotic movement, perfect organization. Footmen descended the steps in precise formation while maids waited quietly beneath the entrance lanterns. At their center stood an older woman dressed in deep navy silk with silver hair arranged flawlessly at the base of her neck. She carried herself with the calm authority of someone who governed the household more effectively than most politicians govern cities. Theodore stepped out first. Every servant straightened instantly the moment his shoes touched the stone. No one spoke. No one rushed forward unnecessarily. Lillian hesitated briefly before accepting Theodore's hand again and stepping down from the carriage. Cold mountain air swept across her cheeks immediately. The older woman's eyes moved toward Lillian at once. Sharp gray eyes, intelligent ones. She studied Lillian carefully for less than 2 seconds before inclining her head respectfully. Respectfully, not curiously. "Welcome home, Miss Valecrest," the woman said calmly. Lillian blinked once. "Home." Theodore removed his gloves slowly beside her. "Mrs. Norwood manages Blackmere Hall." Mrs. Norwood stepped forward slightly. "Your rooms have been prepared, miss." "Rooms, plural." Lillian looked briefly toward Theodore. He had already turned toward the entrance, speaking quietly to one of the footmen regarding the luggage. "The blue case goes to the East Wing," he instructed. East Wing. Something about the words settled strangely inside her chest. Mrs. Norwood gestured gently toward the open doors. "You must be cold after the journey." Lillian followed her inside slowly while Theodore remained briefly behind speaking with the staff outside. The warmth hit her immediately. So did the silence. Blackmere Hall did not resemble the bright, excessive estates she had visited during New York social seasons. No gold overload. No crowded decorations competing for attention. Everything inside the entrance hall carried restrained elegance. Dark walnut floors polished to mirror shine. Massive staircases curving upward beneath crystal chandeliers. Oil paintings framed in black wood instead of gold. Tall windows overlooking pine-covered mountains, hidden beneath drifting fog. The entire manor felt calm in the unsettling way cathedrals often felt calm. Mrs. Norwood removed her gloves carefully while leading Lillian farther into the hall. "Breakfast will be served whenever you wish," she said. "The Duke instructed us not to disturb you until you have rested." Lillian glanced toward her. "He planned my arrival carefully." Mrs. Norwood's expression did not change. "The Duke plans everything carefully." They passed several servants moving silently through the corridors. Each person acknowledged Lillian respectfully. Not one displayed surprise. Not one whispered. It was impossible. News of the ballroom must have reached Blackmere before dawn. Yet no one looked at her the way society had looked at her only hours earlier. Mrs. Norwood led her toward the grand staircase. "You have worked for His Grace long?" Lillian asked quietly. 22 years. "Then you knew him before he inherited the title." "Yes." Mrs. Norwood paused briefly near the stairs before adding. "He was very young when his father died." The statement carried weight beneath its calmness. Lillian sensed immediately that the woman had revealed more than intended. They climbed the staircase together beneath soft morning light filtering through enormous windows overhead. Halfway up, Lillian noticed something unusual. Portraits lined the walls ascending toward the second floor, but there were fewer than expected for a family estate this large. Many spaces stood empty. Bare outlines remained visible against darker wallpaper where paintings had once hung. "The walls look unfinished," Lillian said quietly. Mrs. Norwood's footsteps slowed almost imperceptibly. "His Grace removed several portraits years ago. Why?" "He disliked them." The answer arrived too quickly. Prepared. Lillian looked back toward the empty spaces while unease moved softly through her chest again. Blackmere Hall was beautiful, but beneath the beauty something else lingered. Silence. Secrets. The east wing hallway appeared moments later beyond a set of dark double doors. Sunlight had not fully reached this side of the manor yet. Long shadows stretched across polished floors while distant windows overlooked the mist-covered lake below the cliffs. Mrs. Norwood stopped before a large set of carved oak doors near the end of the corridor. "These rooms belong exclusively to you now, Miss Valecrest." Lillian stared at the doors. "Exclusively?" Mrs. Norwood opened them carefully. Warm light spilled across the hallway immediately. Lillian stepped inside and forgot how to breathe. The sitting room alone was larger than the entire third floor at Valecrest Manor. Pale cream walls reflected soft morning light from towering windows draped in dark blue velvet. Fresh flowers rested beside the fireplace. Books lined walnut shelves along the far wall. A piano stood near the windows overlooking the lake. Everything smelled faintly of cedarwood and lavender. But it was not the luxury that froze her in place. It was the impossible familiarity. The flowers beside the fireplace were white camellias, her favorite since childhood. The books on the shelves included the exact poetry collection she used to borrow secretly from the Valecrest library because her mother considered it impractical. Near the piano sat a small porcelain horse with one broken ear, identical to the one hidden inside her luggage downstairs. Lillian stepped farther into the room slowly. Her pulse stumbled unevenly beneath her ribs. "How?" Mrs. Norwood watched her carefully from the doorway. "His Grace selected everything personally." Lillian turned toward her sharply. "Personally?" "Yes." Fear moved coldly down her spine then. Not loud fear, quiet fear. The kind that arrived when pieces of a puzzle suddenly began fitting together in ways they should not. Her eyes drifted slowly across the room once more. The blue curtains, the books, the flowers, the porcelain horse. Not random luxury. Knowledge. Theodore Ravenshade had not prepared a guest room. He had recreated fragments of her life inside Blackmere Hall before she ever arrived. And somewhere deep beneath the silence of the manor, Lillian began understanding that the ballroom had never been coincidence at all. Lillian remained standing in the center of the sitting room long after Mrs. Norwood quietly withdrew and closed the doors behind her. The silence inside the east wing felt different from the silence at Valecrest Manor. Not cold exactly. Intentional. Every object surrounding her carried the uncomfortable sensation of having been chosen with care by someone who understood her far too well. She moved slowly toward the bookshelf nearest the fireplace, her fingertips brushing lightly across polished walnut shelves. Poetry collections, American history volumes, botanical studies. Even a worn copy of Little Women rested near the center shelf with faded blue cloth binding nearly identical to the one she had read repeatedly as a child beneath blankets with a candle after midnight. Her breath slowed unevenly. No one at Valecrest ever noticed what she read. Most of the household barely noticed her at all. Yet Theodore Ravenshade somehow knew the exact stories she returned to when she felt alone. The realization pressed heavily against her chest. She crossed toward the piano next. The dark, polished instrument stood near the tall windows overlooking the mist-covered lake below the cliffs. Sheet music rested neatly on the stand. Lillian glanced down at it and froze again. Claire de Lune. Her fingers tightened slowly at her sides. She had played that exact piece during one winter charity gathering 3 years earlier after another pianist became ill moments before the guests arrived. She remembered it clearly because her mother later complained that performing publicly made her appear desperate for attention. Lillian stared at the music in silence. Theodore could not have known that, unless he had been there. The thought unsettled her so sharply she stepped back instinctively. A soft knock sounded at the doors behind her before she could think further. "Miss Valecrest." Mrs. Norwood's voice carried through the wood calmly. "Breakfast has been prepared whenever you are ready." Lillian forced her breathing steady again. Thank you. Would you prefer privacy this morning? The question lingered strangely, as though the woman already suspected Lillian needed time alone to process what she had discovered. Yes, Lillian answered quietly. For a little while. Of course. Footsteps retreated softly down the hallway beyond the doors. Lillian moved toward the windows once the silence returned. The lake below Blackmere Hall stretched across the mountainside like dark glass beneath the pale morning sky. Pine forests surrounded the water on every side, while low clouds drifted between distant cliffs. The estate looked isolated from the rest of the world. Beautiful. Impossible to escape quickly. Her reflection appeared faintly against the glass. Pale face, exhausted eyes, loose curls still falling around her shoulders from the long journey. Nothing about her looked important enough to justify this level of attention from a man like Theodore Ravenshade. Yet every detail inside the room insisted otherwise. She looked toward the porcelain horse near the piano again. Identical. Not similar. Identical. Her pulse stumbled softly beneath her ribs. Lillian crossed the room and reached carefully for the figurine. The smooth ceramic felt cool against her fingertips. One ear chipped at the exact same angle as the toy hidden inside her luggage downstairs. She turned it over slowly. A date had been engraved beneath the base in faded silver script. 1898. 5 years before she was born. A quiet knock interrupted her thoughts again. Firmer this time. Not Mrs. Norwood. Lillian set the figurine back carefully onto the piano. Come in. The doors opened almost immediately. Theodore entered alone. He had changed clothes since arriving at Blackmere Hall. The dark traveling coat was gone now, replaced by a charcoal vest and crisp white shirt rolled slightly at the sleeves. Without the heavy coat, he somehow looked both younger and more dangerous. Less distant aristocrat. More man entirely accustomed to command. He closed the doors quietly behind himself before speaking. You should rest. Lillian watched him carefully across the room. I tried. Theodore's eyes moved briefly toward the piano beside her. Toward the porcelain horse. He noticed immediately that she had touched it. Of course he did. You prepared these rooms before last night. It was not a question. Theodore remained silent for several seconds. Yes. The direct honesty startled her more than denial would have. How long? Another pause. A while. Lillian let out a soft breath that almost sounded like disbelief. That is not an answer. Theodore walked farther into the room then. Slow measured steps against the polished floor. He stopped near the fireplace without sitting. Even relaxed, he carried the quiet pressure of authority everywhere around him. You are tired, he said calmly. And frightened. You say that as though you are not the reason. Something flickered briefly near his eyes. Not offense. Closer to regret. I know. The simplicity of the answer unsettled her again. Theodore did not defend himself. He rarely seemed interested in defending himself at all. Why are my favorite books here? She asked softly. Why that music? His gaze held her steadily. Because I knew you would recognize them. The truth landed heavily in the silence between them. Lillian felt her throat tighten slightly. How? Theodore looked toward the windows overlooking the lake. For the first time since meeting him, hesitation became visible in his posture. Very slight, but unmistakable. Do you remember Boston? He asked quietly. She blinked once. I have visited Boston many times. 3 winters ago. St. Catherine's Charity Gala. Lillian searched her memory carefully. Candlelight. Music. Wealthy donors speaking too loudly beneath crystal chandeliers. The pianist became ill. Theodore continued. You played instead. Her breath caught softly. You were there. Theodore inclined his head once. Yes. Lillian stared at him. You never spoke to me. No. But you remembered the music. Theodore's jaw tightened faintly. I remembered everything. The room grew painfully quiet after that. Lillian looked away first, toward the lake beyond the windows because the intensity of his attention had become difficult to endure directly. You watched me. Yes. Why? Theodore's fingers flexed once near his side before stilling again. At first, I wanted to be certain. Certain of what? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he crossed slowly toward the bookshelf nearest the fireplace and reached for something resting on the highest shelf. A photograph. Small. Framed in dark silver. Theodore held it for a moment before extending it toward her silently. Lillian hesitated before accepting it. The image showed an enormous garden somewhere beneath summer sunlight. A woman stood near the center wearing a pale dress while holding the hand of a little girl no older than 5. The child's face tilted partially toward the camera. Dark curls. Thin white ribbon. Serious eyes. Lillian's breath stopped. The little girl looked exactly like her. Not similar. Exactly. Her fingers tightened around the frame. What is this? Theodore watched her carefully now. Too carefully. That photograph was taken 20 years ago. Who is she? Theodore's voice lowered almost imperceptibly. Her name was Eleanor Vale. Lillian looked up sharply. Vale? Theodore nodded once. Before your family changed it to Valecrest. Cold moved slowly through her chest then. Not panic. Something stranger. Like standing near the edge of a memory she could not quite reach. I do not understand. Theodore's eyes remained fixed on her face. I know. Lillian looked back down at the photograph. The little girl's expression felt hauntingly familiar. Not because she resembled Lillian physically. Because something in the child's posture reminded her of herself completely. Quietness mistaken for weakness. Observation mistaken for fear. Why do you have this? She whispered. Theodore did not answer immediately. Outside the tall windows, wind moved softly across the lake while pale sunlight slowly burned through the morning fog over Blackmere Hall. Because, he said at last, I have been searching for her most of my life. Lillian felt the room tilt almost imperceptibly around her. Her pulse stumbled unevenly beneath her ribs. That little girl, she said slowly. You think she is me? Theodore stepped closer then. Not threateningly. Carefully. As though sudden movements might frighten her away. No, he answered quietly. I know she is. Silence crashed between them. Heavy. Absolute. Lillian stared at him while the photograph trembled faintly in her hands. Theodore noticed immediately. His eyes dropped toward her fingers before lifting back to her face again. You are safe here, he said softly. But for the first time since arriving at Blackmere Hall, Lillian was no longer certain that safety was what frightened her most. Lillian did not realize she had stepped backward until the edge of the piano pressed softly against the back of her legs. The photograph remained trembling faintly between her fingers while Theodore stood only a few feet away near the center of the sitting room. Morning light drifted through the tall windows behind him in pale silver bands, softening the sharpness of his features without making him appear less dangerous. If anything, the quiet sincerity in his expression unsettled her more than coldness would have. No, she said softly. The word escaped automatically. Theodore did not move closer. Lillian. No, her voice strengthened slightly this time. That is impossible. Theodore watched her steadily while silence settled heavily between them again. He seemed to understand instinctively that pushing her now would only frighten her further. You were born in Charleston, Lillian continued quickly, at St. Augustine Hospital. My mother told me that story 100 times. Theodore's jaw tightened faintly. Margaret Valecrest told you many things. She is still my mother. The answer came too fast. Defensive. Theodore noticed immediately. Of course he noticed. I did not say otherwise. Lillian looked back down at the photograph. The child's dark curls framed a serious face turned halfway toward the camera. Familiar eyes. Familiar posture. The resemblance unsettled her because it reached beyond appearance into something harder to explain. She could almost imagine herself standing in that garden beneath summer sunlight 20 years earlier. The sensation made her chest tighten sharply. Who was Eleanor Vale? Theodore remained silent for several seconds before answering. The daughter of Nathaniel Vale. And who was he? My father's closest friend. Lillian lifted her eyes slowly toward him again. Theodore's expression had changed almost imperceptibly while speaking the name. Something quieter moved beneath the control now. Memory, perhaps. Or grief. What happened to her? Theodore looked briefly toward the windows overlooking the lake. There was a fire. The room seemed to grow colder around her. When? 20 years ago. Lillian swallowed carefully. You said you searched for her most of your life. Theodore nodded once. I was 14 when she disappeared. 14. Young enough for grief to remain unfinished forever. Lillian looked down at the photograph again. The little girl appeared no older than 5. You knew her personally. Another silence. Then, quietly, yes. Something in the simplicity of the answer unsettled her more deeply than elaborate explanations would have. Theodore rarely spoke emotionally, which meant the few simple truths he offered carried weight. Lillian crossed slowly toward the fireplace, needing movement because the room suddenly felt too small around her thoughts. You are asking me to believe that my entire life is false. No, Theodore's voice remained calm behind her. I am asking you to consider that your life may not be what you were told it was. Lillian stared into the fire without truly seeing it. Flames shifted softly behind black iron grates while distant wind moved across the lake outside. Why did you never contact me before now? She asked at last. Theodore did not answer immediately. I was not completely certain until Boston. She turned toward him again. Because of the piano? Because of your hands? Confusion crossed her face. Theodore stepped slowly toward the bookshelf beside the fireplace and reached for another small object resting there. A folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. He handed it toward her silently. Lillian hesitated before taking it. The paper was old enough to feel fragile between her fingers. A child's drawing covered most of the page in faded colored pencil. A lake, pine trees, a large gray house beside water. And in the lower corner, written in uneven childish letters, were the words, Blackmere. Her pulse stumbled violently. What is this? Theodore's eyes never left her face. You drew it. Lillian stared at the paper in disbelief. No, you were 5. I have never seen this before. Theodore nodded slightly. I know. Her fingers tightened around the fragile paper. The handwriting looked unfamiliar at first, then not unfamiliar at all. Certain curves in the letters resembled the way she still crossed her capital L's. Small details, impossible details. Fear moved slowly down her spine again. Where did you get this? You gave it to me. Her breath caught softly. That is not possible. Theodore remained perfectly still. You used to leave drawings outside my father's study because you thought the house looked lonely. Lillian stared at him in complete silence. He spoke with impossible certainty. Not hesitation. Not theory. Memory. The distinction terrified her. Stop, she whispered. Theodore's expression changed immediately. Lillian, stop speaking as though you know me. The words emerged sharper than intended. Pain flashed briefly across his face before disappearing almost instantly beneath control. But she saw it. You cannot appear after 20 years with photographs and drawings and expect me to suddenly become someone else. Theodore lowered his gaze briefly toward the paper still trembling in her hands. I know. Do you? Her throat tightened painfully now. Because I do not even know what you want from me. Silence filled the room once more. Theodore looked exhausted suddenly. Not physically. Something deeper. Like a man carrying a burden too long without rest. I want you safe, he said quietly. Lillian laughed softly then. Not because anything felt amusing. Because the alternative was crying, and years inside Valecrest Manor had taught her never to do that in front of others. Everyone keeps saying that. Theodore's eyes sharpened slightly at the word everyone. Who else? Lillian looked away toward the fire again. My mother warned me powerful men never act without reason. Theodore's expression darkened almost imperceptibly. Your mother is correct. Then what is your reason? He stepped closer finally. Slowly, carefully. You disappeared 20 years ago after a fire that killed 3 people. His voice lowered. Including my father. The room went completely still around her. Lillian forgot to breathe. Theodore continued watching her with frightening steadiness. The investigation concluded Eleanor Vale died with them. Lillian's pulse hammered unevenly beneath her ribs. But you did not believe it. No, why? Theodore's jaw tightened faintly. Because I saw you leave the house. Silence crashed through the room, heavy enough to feel physical. Lillian stared at him while her mind struggled desperately to follow the words. What? Theodore looked toward the windows briefly before continuing. There was smoke everywhere. My father pushed me outside through the east corridor. His voice remained controlled, but strain moved beneath it now. Old strain. I saw a woman carrying you through the gardens toward the woods behind Blackmere. Lillian's fingers loosened around the drawing slightly. A woman. Theodore nodded once. I never saw her face clearly. And you think that woman brought me to Charleston? No, his eyes lifted back toward hers. I think she brought you to the Valecrests. Cold spread through Lillian's chest so suddenly she nearly dropped the photograph still resting in her other hand. That is insane. Theodore did not react to the word. Perhaps. You have no proof. No, another pause. Only patterns. Lillian shook her head once, slow and disbelieving. This cannot be happening. Theodore moved closer again, though still leaving careful distance between them. You do not have to believe everything immediately. You are asking me to doubt my own life. I am asking you to ask questions. The fire crackled softly between them while pale sunlight drifted farther across the room. Somewhere deep inside Blackmere Hall, a grandfather clock chimed 11 times. Lillian closed her eyes briefly. Questions. There were too many already. Why did the porcelain horse match hers exactly? Why did Theodore know her favorite books and music? Why did the child in the photograph look so unmistakably familiar? Most terrifying of all, why did some small hidden part of her feel drawn toward Blackmere Hall in ways she could not explain? She opened her eyes slowly again. Theodore still watched her with that same unbearable focus. What happens now? She whispered. Theodore's expression softened almost invisibly. Now, he said quietly, we find out who tried to erase you. The words lingered in the room long after Theodore stopped speaking. Lillian stood motionless beside the fireplace with the old photograph still clutched carefully between her fingers while morning sunlight drifted slowly across the floorboards beneath the tall windows. Find out who tried to erase you. The sentence sounded impossible. Dramatic. The sort of thing whispered in novels beside candlelight and storms. Yet Theodore had not spoken dramatically. He never did. That was what frightened her most. He spoke the way certain men discussed weather or business arrangements. Calmly, precisely, as though the truth existed whether anyone felt prepared for it or not. Lillian lowered her eyes toward the photograph again. The little girl stared back at her from 20 years earlier with solemn dark eyes and one hand tangled loosely in the folds of a pale summer dress. Eleanor Vale. The name no longer sounded entirely unfamiliar. That unsettled her deeply. Not because she remembered it clearly. She did not. But because something about the sound of it stirred faintly beneath layers of memory she could not reach. Like hearing a song once loved in childhood without remembering where. Theodore watched her quietly across the room. He seemed willing to let silence stretch as long as necessary. Most people rushed to fill uncomfortable moments. Theodore studied them instead. You think my family knew? Lillian said finally. Theodore's jaw tightened faintly. I think someone paid them to keep you hidden. Hidden. Not adopted. Not rescued. Hidden. Lillian crossed slowly toward the nearest window, needing distance from the intensity of his attention even though part of her already understood she would not truly escape it anywhere inside Blackmere Hall. Outside, the lake shimmered beneath pale winter sunlight while wind moved softly across dark water far below the cliffs. Why would anyone do that? Theodore remained near the fireplace. Because Eleanor Vale inherited something valuable. Lillian turned sharply. Money? No, Theodore's expression darkened slightly. Control. Silence followed immediately. I do not understand. Theodore looked toward the old photograph in her hand before speaking again. Nathaniel Vale owned half the northern rail lines crossing Massachusetts before the fire. Lillian stared at him. Half. And your mother inherited all of it after his death. Her breath caught softly. Theodore's voice remained level. At 5 years old, Eleanor Vale became one of the wealthiest children in the country. The room tilted almost imperceptibly around her again. That is impossible. No, Theodore's eyes lifted steadily toward hers. It is documented. Lillian shook her head once, slow and disbelieving. The Valecrests were drowning in debt for most of my life. Theodore did not answer immediately. Then quietly, yes. Understanding moved through her chest like ice water. Slow. Sharp. You think they used me? Theodore's silence confirmed it more clearly than words could have. Lillian turned back toward the windows before he could see the sudden trembling in her expression. Memories surfaced unexpectedly then. Small things she had never questioned before. Her father becoming furious whenever she asked about old family papers. Her mother insisting repeatedly that certain rooms remained locked because they contained nothing important. The countless arguments about money overheard through thin walls late at night. And always, the strange contradiction of her parents treating her simultaneously as worthless and strangely necessary. Theodore moved toward the desk near the windows then and opened one drawer carefully. He removed a thin leather folder before crossing back toward her. I did not want to show you this today. Lillian looked toward the folder warily. Then why are you? Because after last night, your family will realize I know who you are. The sentence tightened every muscle in her body. Theodore handed her the folder. Inside rested copies of legal documents yellowed faintly with age. Official seals. Property records. Newspaper clippings. Her eyes stopped on one name immediately. Eleanor Catherine Vale. Catherine, she whispered. Theodore watched her carefully. Your middle name. Her fingers tightened around the papers. My mother's name is Margaret. Yes. Theodore's voice lowered almost imperceptibly. Which means someone chose the name Catherine for you before the Valecrests did. Lillian stared down at the documents while her pulse hammered unevenly beneath her ribs. Tiny details suddenly felt dangerous. Her full birth name. The strange familiarity of Blackmere Hall. The way Theodore looked at her as though he had spent years memorizing her existence from fragments. How long have you known? She asked softly. Theodore answered without hesitation. 3 years. She lifted her eyes immediately toward him. 3 years. Boston confirmed it. The room became painfully quiet again. You watched me for 3 years without saying anything. Theodore's expression did not change, though exhaustion shadowed his face more visibly now. I investigated quietly first. Investigated me. Yes. The honesty should not have startled her anymore. Yet somehow it still did. Most people lied to make difficult truths easier to swallow. Theodore simply handed them to her directly and waited for the consequences. That is not normal behavior. Something almost resembling dry amusement flickered near his eyes for less than a second. No, he admitted softly. It is not. Lillian closed the folder carefully and rested it against the desk beside her. Then why wait until now? Theodore looked toward the lake beyond the windows. Because until last night you were safer hidden. Cold settled heavily through her chest. Safer from who? Theodore did not answer immediately. The hesitation itself became an answer. Someone connected to the fire, Lillian whispered. Theodore's silence confirmed it again. Wind brushed softly against the tall windows while clouds drifted across the mountains beyond the lake. Blackmere Hall suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like the center of something old and unfinished. A knock interrupted the silence before either of them spoke again. 3 precise knocks against the doors. Theodore's expression hardened instantly. Not dramatically, like steel cooling. Enter. Mrs. Norwood stepped inside carrying a silver tray with untouched breakfast tea. But her attention moved first toward Theodore, not the tray. Your Grace. Something in her tone sharpened the air immediately. Theodore crossed toward her. What is it? Mrs. Norwood glanced briefly toward Lillian before lowering her voice. A message arrived from Charleston. Lillian felt her stomach tighten. Theodore extended his hand calmly. Mrs. Norwood passed him a folded telegram. He read it once without visible reaction. Then again more slowly. The silence stretched. Lillian watched his face carefully. Nothing changed outwardly. Yet something dangerous settled behind his eyes almost immediately afterward. Theodore. His attention lifted toward her at the sound of his name. Not your grace. Theodore. The smallest flicker crossed his expression before vanishing again. What happened? He folded the telegram carefully. Too carefully. Your family has left Charleston. The room went still. Left. Their accounts were emptied before dawn. Lillian stared at him. They ran. Theodore nodded once. Yes. Her pulse stumbled violently. That does not make sense. It makes perfect sense. His voice remained calm, controlled. They know I recognized you. Fear moved coldly through her chest again. Real fear this time. Not confusion. Not uncertainty. Her family had fled within hours of her arrival at Blackmere Hall. Not after confrontation. Not after accusations. After Theodore simply took her away. They knew, she whispered. Theodore's jaw tightened faintly. Yes. Lillian gripped the edge of the desk hard enough for her knuckles to pale. Every memory from childhood suddenly felt unstable beneath her feet. Every story. Every explanation. Every silence. No, she said softly. No, they would not. But the words died before finishing because part of her already understood. Theodore stepped toward her carefully. Lillian. She looked up at him sharply. Did they ever show you photographs from your childhood? Silence answered first. Then realization. Her breath caught painfully. No, there had never been photographs. Not one. Margaret always claimed a flood ruined them years earlier. Theodore watched understanding spread slowly across her face. Not satisfaction. Never satisfaction. Only quiet grief. I am sorry, he said softly. The gentleness of the apology nearly undid her. Lillian looked away immediately toward the windows because suddenly breathing felt difficult. Below the cliffs, the lake shimmered beneath cold sunlight while Blackmere Hall remained impossibly still around them. Safe, silent, full of secrets. Theodore remained nearby without touching her. Close enough to steady her if she fell. Far enough to let her choose distance if needed. What happens now? She whispered after a long silence. Theodore glanced briefly toward the folded telegram in his hand. Now, he said quietly. They will try to disappear before we find them first. The rest of the morning passed in a strange, fragile silence that settled over Blackmere Hall like mist over the lake below the cliffs. Theodore left the east wing shortly after the telegram arrived, though not before quietly instructing Mrs. Norwood that no visitors were to enter the estate without his direct permission. Lillian heard the order from across the sitting room while still standing beside the windows with the old photograph pressed lightly against her chest. No visitors. The words should have sounded excessive. Instead, they deepened the cold unease growing steadily beneath her ribs. Her family had vanished overnight. Not disappeared casually. Fled. That single detail changed everything. Mrs. Norwood remained with Lillian for a short while after Theodore departed. Not hovering. Simply present. The older woman moved through the sitting room calmly, adjusting the tea tray near the fireplace and opening the curtains farther against the fading morning fog. You should eat something, miss, she said gently. Lillian stared down at the untouched breakfast table. I do not think I can. Mrs. Norwood looked toward her quietly. His Grace rarely leaves this house unsettled. The statement caught Lillian's attention immediately. Rarely. Mrs. Norwood folded one linen napkin with precise movements. I have worked for him more than 2 decades. Her expression softened almost imperceptibly. He has not slept properly since you arrived. Lillian blinked once. That is impossible. No, Mrs. Norwood glanced briefly toward the closed doors leading deeper into the east wing. It is simply unusual. Silence settled again. Lillian lowered herself slowly into one of the velvet chairs near the fireplace while the old photograph rested against her lap. Her thoughts felt tangled beyond order now. Theodore had searched for her since childhood. He had recognized her 3 years earlier. He had prepared rooms for her long before the ballroom in Charleston. None of it sounded sane. Yet every detail inside Blackmere Hall insisted he was telling the truth. "Mrs. Norwood." The older woman turned slightly. "Yes, miss?" Lillian hesitated before asking the question quietly. "Do you believe him?" Mrs. Norwood did not answer immediately. Instead, she crossed toward the windows overlooking the lake and adjusted one curtain slowly before speaking. "I believe Theodore Ravenshade has never spent 20 years pursuing something without certainty." The use of his first name startled Lillian faintly. It was the first time anyone inside the manor had spoken it aloud. "You have known all this time," Lillian whispered. Mrs. Norwood looked toward her calmly. "I knew he was searching for someone, but not me." No, another pause. "Until Boston." Lillian felt her pulse tighten slightly again. "He told you about that night." He spoke of little else afterward. Heat rose faintly beneath her skin before she could stop it. Mrs. Norwood noticed immediately, though kindness softened her expression instead of amusement. "You must understand something carefully, Miss Valecrest." Lillian lifted her eyes slowly. "Theodore does not form attachments easily." The words lingered heavily between them. Attachments. Lillian looked down toward the photograph in her lap again. "This does not feel like attachment." Mrs. Norwood's gaze drifted briefly toward the fireplace. "No," she admitted softly. "It feels older than that." The silence that followed carried no comfort. Around noon, Lillian finally wandered farther into the East Wing for the first time since arriving at Blackmere Hall. A maid offered to accompany her immediately, though not intrusively. Everything inside the manor operated with the same strange balance of discipline and quiet care. No one questioned her movements. No one stared. Yet servants seemed to appear instantly whenever she needed something before disappearing just as quickly afterward. The East Wing itself overlooked the cliffs and lake below the estate. Long hallways stretched beneath high ceilings painted with faded constellations, while enormous windows filled the corridors with pale winter light. The entire wing felt quieter than the rest of the manor. More private. Almost protected. Lillian slowed near one open doorway where shelves of books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. A library. Smaller than the grand one downstairs but warmer somehow. More personal. She stepped inside instinctively. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood and old paper. A fire burned quietly near the far wall while afternoon sunlight drifted across worn leather chairs arranged beside tall windows. Several books lay open across one table near the center of the room. One title immediately caught her attention. Railway Expansion Reports. Another, Massachusetts Inheritance Statutes. Lillian's stomach tightened softly. Theodore had been researching her. Not recently. For years. Her fingers brushed lightly across the spine of one leather-bound volume when a voice behind her spoke calmly. "You are standing in my favorite room." Lillian turned sharply. Theodore leaned against the doorway watching her. He had removed his jacket sometime earlier, leaving only the dark vest and white shirt rolled slightly at the sleeves again. Fatigue shadowed his face more visibly now beneath the afternoon light. Yet the moment he looked at her, something sharpened inside his expression instantly. Focus. Complete and unwavering. "I did not mean to intrude." Theodore crossed slowly into the library. "You are not intruding anywhere in this house." The statement landed with dangerous softness. Lillian looked away toward the bookshelves instead of answering immediately. "You researched inheritance law." Theodore followed her gaze briefly toward the table. "Yes. Because of me. Yes." Always honesty. Always directness. It should have made him easier to understand. Somehow it only made him more unsettling. Theodore stopped a few feet away beside the fireplace. "Have you eaten?" Lillian almost smiled despite herself. "That is the third time someone has asked me today." "You did not answer the first two." Her eyes lifted toward him automatically. For one brief moment, something dangerously close to warmth moved beneath his controlled expression. Small. Nearly invisible. yet unmistakably human. The realization startled her more than his coldness ever had. "No," she admitted quietly. Theodore nodded once toward the small table near the windows where tea and untouched sandwiches rested beneath silver covers. "Sit." The word should have sounded commanding. Instead it sounded tired. Lillian hesitated before finally moving toward the table. Theodore remained standing until she sat down first. Another strange detail. Men like Edgar Valecrest never waited for women. Theodore seemed to notice such things instinctively. Lillian reached slowly for a cup of tea while Theodore poured coffee into his own, without asking whether she wanted assistance. The restraint again. He never treated her as fragile despite watching her constantly. "Did you truly believe I was dead all these years?" she asked softly. Theodore's hand paused briefly against the coffee cup. "No. Even after the investigation?" "The investigation was wrong." "How could you know that?" Theodore looked toward the fire instead of her. "Because I saw you alive." Silence settled heavily over the library again. Lillian studied him carefully across the table. He never exaggerated, never dramatized his words, which meant he had carried that certainty alone for 20 years while everyone else called him mistaken. "Did people think you imagined it?" Theodore's jaw tightened faintly. "Yes." Something painful moved quietly through her chest then. Not pity, closer to understanding. She knew what it meant to speak truths no one wished to hear. "And still you searched." Theodore lifted his eyes toward her again. "Every year." The room seemed smaller suddenly, more intimate than it should have. Lillian lowered her gaze quickly toward the tea trembling faintly inside her cup. "Why?" she whispered. Theodore studied her in silence long enough that she thought he might refuse to answer. Then quietly, "Because you mattered." Her breath caught softly. The simplicity of the statement nearly undid her more than grand declarations ever could have. Because he did not say it like flattery. He said it like fact. Before she could respond, sharp footsteps echoed suddenly from the hallway outside the library. Fast. Urgent. Theodore straightened immediately. Every trace of softness vanished from his expression in an instant. Mrs. Norwood appeared in the doorway moments later, visibly pale for the first time since Lillian met her. "Your Grace." Theodore was already moving toward her. "What happened?" Mrs. Norwood glanced briefly toward Lillian before lowering her voice. "There is a man at the south gate insisting he must speak with Miss Valecrest immediately." Lillian's fingers tightened sharply around the teacup. Theodore's expression turned cold enough to still the air itself. "Who?" Mrs. Norwood swallowed carefully. "Her father." Silence crashed through the library. Heavy. Dangerous. Theodore looked toward Lillian slowly then. The fury in his eyes disappeared instantly the moment it reached her, replaced instead by something colder and far more controlled. "He should not have found this estate so quickly," he said quietly. Lillian felt her pulse begin hammering beneath her ribs. "What does he want?" Theodore's jaw hardened almost imperceptibly. "That," he said softly, "depends on how desperate he truly is." Lillian had never seen Theodore move quickly before. Everything about him usually carried measured restraint, even anger. But the moment Mrs. Norwood spoke Edgar Valecrest's name, something changed beneath the calm surface he maintained so carefully. Not loss of control. Something colder. More dangerous because it remained controlled. Theodore crossed the library in 3 silent steps and stopped near the doorway beside Mrs. Norwood. "How many guards are at the gate?" 4. Mrs. Norwood answered immediately. "He arrived alone." Theodore nodded once. "Keep him there." "Yes, Your Grace." Mrs. Norwood disappeared down the hallway almost instantly. The silence she left behind felt sharp enough to cut. Lillian remained seated near the windows with her untouched tea cooling between trembling fingers. Her pulse hammered unevenly beneath her ribs. Edgar Valecrest had come to Blackmere Hall himself. Not a letter. Not a telegram. Himself. Theodore turned back toward her slowly. Every trace of warmth from earlier conversations had vanished from his expression now, replaced by the same unreadable composure he carried the night of the ballroom. Yet his eyes betrayed him slightly. Fury moved there. Quiet. Controlled. Very real. You do not have to see him, he said. Lillian stared at him. You think he came here for money? Yes. No hesitation. And if not money? Theodore's jaw tightened faintly. Then information. The words settled heavily in the room. Lillian lowered her eyes briefly toward the steam fading from her teacup. Information. Questions pressed painfully against the inside of her mind now. Questions about the fire. About Eleanor Vale. About the years between. But beneath all of it lived one terrible realization she could no longer avoid. Her father had fled Charleston after Theodore recognized her. Not after accusations. Not after proof. After recognition alone. I need to speak with him, she whispered. Theodore's expression hardened instantly. No, she looked up sharply. You do not get to decide that. Silence fell. Dangerous silence. Theodore stared at her for several long seconds while the fire cracked softly behind them. He sold you publicly less than 48 hours ago, he said quietly. And now he appears at Blackmere after fleeing the city overnight. His voice lowered further. You are not meeting him alone. The certainty in his tone ignited sudden frustration inside her chest. You keep speaking as though I belong to you. The words landed harder than intended. Theodore went completely still. The room itself seemed to still with him. Lillian immediately regretted it. Not because the statement was entirely false. Because she saw something unexpectedly painful move across his face before the control returned. No, Theodore said at last. Very quietly. I speak as someone trying to keep you alive. Her anger faltered instantly. The raw honesty beneath the words unsettled her more than shouting ever could have. Theodore looked away first, toward the windows overlooking the lake below the cliffs. You are free to hate me later if necessary, he said calmly. But right now you remain under this house's protection. Protection. Always that word. Lillian stood slowly from the chair beside the windows. You genuinely believe I am in danger? Theodore looked back toward her. Yes. From my own family. Yes. Silence stretched painfully between them again. Lillian pressed one hand lightly against the edge of the table to steady herself. Nothing felt stable anymore. Not her name. Not her childhood. Not even the memories she trusted most. And somehow Theodore Ravenshade had become the only solid thing left inside the chaos despite frightening her more than anyone else ever had. The realization felt dangerous. Then come with me, she said softly. Theodore's eyes sharpened immediately. What? If I speak with him, you stay beside me. Something unreadable flickered briefly across his expression. Relief, perhaps. Or surprise. All right, he answered quietly. 15 minutes later, Lillian descended the grand staircase beside Theodore, while cold afternoon light spilled through the enormous windows lining the entrance hall. Blackmere Hall remained unnaturally silent around them. Servants moved carefully through distant corridors while armed guards stood near the front doors with rigid attention. The entire estate felt tense now beneath its polished elegance, as though the house itself recognized danger standing outside its gates. Theodore walked beside her with calm, measured steps, one hand resting lightly behind his back. Yet Lillian noticed the subtle details she would have missed days earlier. The tension in his jaw, the dangerous stillness in his shoulders, the way every servant stepped aside instantly when he passed. Fear, not simple respect. Fear from people who understood exactly how ruthless Theodore Ravenshade could become when necessary. The realization sent another uneasy shiver down her spine. They entered a smaller receiving room near the south entrance moments later. Dark wood walls surrounded the space while rain clouds drifted once more beyond tall windows overlooking the estate gates in the distance. Edgar Valecrest stood near the fireplace, twisting his hat repeatedly between nervous hands. Lillian stopped walking the moment she saw him. He looked older than he had 2 nights earlier in Charleston. Smaller somehow. The expensive coats and polished confidence remained, but panic had hollowed him visibly. His eyes lifted immediately toward Lillian. Relief flooded his face so quickly it almost appeared genuine. Almost. Lillian. He moved toward her instinctively. Theodore stepped forward at the exact same moment. Not aggressively. Simply enough to place himself slightly between them. Edgar stopped immediately. The shift was subtle. Yet the meaning could not have been clearer. You do not touch her. Silence crashed through the room. Edgar attempted a strained smile. Your Grace. Theodore said nothing. He simply watched him. Calmly. Coldly. Lillian had seen powerful men intimidate others before through shouting or threats. Theodore did it through silence alone. Edgar cleared his throat uncomfortably beneath the weight of that stare. I came because there has been a misunderstanding. Theodore finally spoke. No one word. Flat. Absolute. Edgar's smile tightened. Surely we can discuss this privately. No again. Calm. Final. Lillian looked between them while tension thickened through the room like gathering storm clouds. Father, she said quietly. Edgar's attention snapped toward her immediately. Lillian, thank God. His voice softened dramatically. We have been worried sick. Theodore's jaw hardened almost imperceptibly beside her. Lillian felt sudden exhaustion wash through her chest. Worried. The word sounded grotesque after the ballroom. You left Charleston overnight. Edgar's fingers tightened around his hat. For business reasons. You emptied your accounts. Silence. Tiny. But enough. Theodore noticed it instantly. So did she. Edgar recovered quickly. Temporary financial adjustments. Why? Lillian asked softly. Her father avoided her eyes then for the first time in her life. Fear moved slowly through her stomach. Theodore spoke before the silence stretched further. Ask him about the fire. Edgar froze. Completely. The reaction lasted less than a second. Yet it changed everything. Lillian felt her pulse stumble violently beneath her ribs. What fire? She whispered. Edgar looked sharply toward Theodore now. Genuine panic flashed openly across his face. You told her. Theodore's voice remained calm. Not enough. Lillian stared at her father while cold realization spread through her chest inch by inch. You know about it. Edgar swallowed visibly. Lillian. No, her voice trembled softly. Do not lie to me again. The room went utterly still. Edgar looked suddenly trapped between them. Theodore remained silent beside her, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. Lillian realized then that Theodore already knew exactly what her father would say, or refused to say. 20 years ago, she whispered, there was a fire at Blackmere. Edgar's face drained further of color. Who told you that? Did you know me before Charleston? Silence answered. Long enough to become unbearable. Then Edgar looked toward Theodore instead of his daughter, and something desperate entered his voice. You should have left her hidden. Theodore's expression turned glacial. Lillian felt the world tilt softly beneath her feet. Hidden. Not adopted. Not rescued. Hidden. Father, she said again, though the word no longer sounded natural. Edgar finally looked toward her. His eyes appeared exhausted now. Defeated. We were trying to protect you. Theodore let out one quiet breath beside her. Not amusement. Disgust. Lillian stared at the man who had raised her and realized suddenly she no longer recognized him at all. From what? Edgar's fingers trembled faintly around the hat crushed between his hands. There were people searching for the Vale fortune after the fire, he said hoarsely. Dangerous people. Theodore's voice cut cleanly through the room. Names. Edgar ignored him completely. His eyes remained fixed desperately on Lillian. Your mother wanted to leave you untouched by all of it. We changed records. Changed names. We thought eventually they would stop looking. Lillian felt her throat tighten painfully. And the money? Edgar's silence answered before words did. Theodore's expression darkened further. Say it. Edgar looked away. We managed the inheritance. Theodore stepped closer then. Not loudly. Not violently. Yet the room itself seemed to recoil around him. You stole from a child, he said softly. Edgar's composure cracked completely. You do not understand what it cost us to keep her hidden. Theodore's eyes turned terrifyingly cold. I understand exactly what it cost her. Silence crashed through the receiving room again, heavy enough to suffocate. Lillian stared at her father while every memory from childhood rearranged itself into something uglier. The constant financial desperation, the secrecy, the way Margaret Valecrest watched her sometimes with something almost resembling guilt before it hardened back into cruelty. None of it had been random. Edgar finally looked toward her again. "Lillian, listen to me carefully." His voice shook now. "You cannot stay here." Theodore's attention sharpened instantly. "Why?" Edgar ignored him. "There are people who will come for you once they realize Blackmere found you." Fear moved visibly across his face. Real fear. "You need to disappear again." Theodore stepped fully beside Lillian then, close enough that warmth brushed faintly against her sleeve. Protective. Certain. "No," he said quietly. Edgar looked at him with open desperation. "You have no idea what is coming." Theodore's expression never changed. "Neither do you." Then, for the first time since entering the room, Theodore reached for Lillian's hand. Not forcefully, carefully. His fingers closed around hers with calm, unmistakable certainty while his eyes remained fixed on Edgar Valecrest. "She is not disappearing again." For one suspended moment, no one in the receiving room moved. Theodore stood beside Lillian with his hand wrapped carefully around hers while Edgar Valecrest stared at them both as though witnessing something he had hoped never to see. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking Blackmere's southern cliffs. Somewhere deeper in the manor, a clock chimed the half-hour. The sound echoed faintly through the silence before fading again. Lillian became painfully aware of Theodore's hand around hers. Warm, steady, not possessive in the way her father had always possessed things. Protective, certain. The distinction unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Edgar exhaled shakily and dragged one trembling hand across his face. "You are making a mistake," he said hoarsely. Theodore's expression remained unreadable. "No, you think power protects people." Edgar laughed softly then, a broken sound without humor. "That is because no one ever taught you what fear feels like." Theodore's eyes turned colder. "Fear does not excuse what you did." Lillian looked between them while unease twisted slowly through her chest. Her father looked genuinely terrified now. Not of Theodore alone. Of something larger, older. "Who was searching for me?" she whispered. Edgar's attention snapped back toward her immediately. "People connected to the Vale estate after the fire." "Names," Theodore repeated quietly. Edgar looked away. "I never knew all of them." Theodore took one slow step forward. "That is not true." Edgar's composure cracked again. "You think I wanted this?" he demanded suddenly. "You think Margaret and I planned 20 years of hiding?" Theodore's grip around Lillian's hand tightened almost imperceptibly. "You accepted the money easily enough. Because we had no choice." The receiving room fell silent again after the words escaped. Edgar seemed to realize too late what he had revealed. Lillian felt her breath stop softly. Theodore's gaze sharpened instantly. "Someone paid you." Edgar closed his eyes briefly. Defeat settled visibly across his face. "At first." The room tilted around Lillian once more. "At first," she repeated faintly. Edgar looked toward her then, and for the first time since arriving at Blackmere Hall, she saw genuine shame beneath his exhaustion. "After the fire, a woman came to us in Charleston carrying a child." His voice sounded distant now, hollow. "She knew Margaret through old family connections. Said the girl needed protection." Lillian's pulse hammered unevenly beneath her ribs. Theodore remained perfectly still beside her. Edgar continued speaking toward the floor instead of either of them. "The woman claimed dangerous people were searching for the surviving heir to the Vale estate. She offered us money to raise the child quietly under another name." "Who was she?" Theodore asked. Edgar shook his head once. "I never learned her real name." Theodore did not believe him. Lillian could feel it immediately in the dangerous stillness settling through the room again. "You expect me to believe you accepted a child from a stranger with no questions." Edgar laughed weakly. "You did not know Margaret then." Theodore's jaw tightened faintly. "No." he agreed quietly. I am beginning to. Lillian's throat felt painfully tight now. Mother knew. Edgar finally looked directly at her again. Yes. The single word shattered something quietly inside her chest. Margaret Valecrest had known all along. Every cruel comment, every cold dismissal, every moment of distance throughout childhood, all while knowing Lillian was not truly hers. Theodore seemed to recognize the exact instant the realization struck her because his attention shifted fully toward her immediately. The fury disappeared from his face at once. Lillian. She could not answer. Memories crashed through her mind too quickly now. Margaret refusing to celebrate birthdays properly because attention spoiled children. Margaret locking certain drawers whenever Lillian entered the room unexpectedly. Margaret staring at her sometimes with a strange, unreadable expression before turning away completely. None of it had been confusion. It had been guilt. The woman who brought me, Lillian whispered after a long silence. What happened to her? Edgar swallowed visibly. She disappeared. Theodore's expression hardened again. Convenient. It is the truth. Edgar's voice rose suddenly with frustration. She left after the arrangements were made. We never saw her again. Theodore studied him for several long seconds. How much money? Edgar hesitated. Theodore repeated the question more quietly this time. How much? $50,000. Lillian stared at her father in stunned silence. $50,000. Enough wealth to transform entire family fortunes 20 years earlier. Theodore's grip around her hand tightened once more before loosening carefully again. Not because he wished to hold her harder. Because anger moved sharply beneath his control. And when the money ended? Theodore asked. Edgar looked exhausted suddenly. Ancient. The estate funds became accessible through trust arrangements as she grew older. Lillian felt cold spread slowly through her chest. You used my inheritance. Edgar did not answer. He did not need to. Theodore's voice turned dangerously soft. Every debt, every investment, every social season. Edgar looked away. We intended to repay it eventually. Theodore let out one quiet breath through his nose. Not amusement. Contempt. Lillian stared at the man who had raised her and realized suddenly she felt nothing recognizable anymore. No anger strong enough for shouting. No grief dramatic enough for tears. Only emptiness. As though the foundations beneath her life had finally collapsed completely. Theodore shifted slightly closer beside her. The movement was subtle. Protective without making a display of it. Why come here now? Theodore asked. Edgar looked toward him sharply. Because they know Blackmere found her. Silence followed immediately. Theodore's eyes narrowed slightly. Who? Edgar hesitated again. I do not know names. You know enough. Edgar dragged trembling fingers through his silver hair. After the telegrams this morning, someone contacted us before we could leave the city. Theodore went completely still. Contacted how? A note delivered to the hotel. Lillian's pulse stumbled. What note? Edgar swallowed carefully. It said if Eleanor Vale resurfaced publicly, the matter unfinished 20 years ago would finally be corrected. The temperature inside the room seemed to drop instantly. Theodore's expression became terrifyingly calm. You brought the note. Edgar reached slowly inside his coat pocket and removed a folded envelope with visibly shaking fingers. Theodore took it immediately. Lillian watched his eyes scan the page once. Then again. The silence stretched. Dangerous silence. Finally Theodore handed the note toward her. The paper trembled faintly between her fingers as she read the single sentence written in sharp black ink. Some fires survive longer than others. No signature. Nothing else. Yet cold fear crawled slowly down her spine anyway. Theodore took the paper back gently before she could continue staring at it. When was this delivered? At dawn. Theodore folded the note once more with precise calmness. Too calm. Lillian recognized now that his calmness often meant anger had moved beyond visible expression entirely. Mrs. Norwood, Theodore said quietly without looking away from Edgar. The doors opened almost immediately. Mrs. Norwood entered with 2 guards already standing behind her. Theodore handed her the note. Increase security across the estate. No one enters the grounds without my authorization. Yes, Your Grace. And contact Hartford immediately. Mrs. Norwood's eyes sharpened slightly. At once. She disappeared again as quickly as she arrived. Edgar looked toward Theodore with visible desperation now. You still do not understand. Theodore finally released Lillian's hand, then only to step fully between her and Edgar instead. The movement happened naturally, instinctively, like breathing. No, Theodore said softly. You are the one who misunderstands something. Edgar stared at him warily. Theodore's voice remained perfectly calm. 20 years ago, people failed to protect her. His eyes turned glacial. That will not happen again. The certainty in the words settled through the receiving room with frightening weight. Edgar seemed to understand it too because some final resistance left his face entirely. He looked suddenly like a man who had spent decades surviving through fear and realized too late he had finally encountered something fear could not control. Lillian stood motionless behind Theodore while rain darkened the windows beyond the cliffs and the manor settled deeper into silence around them. Then, very quietly, Edgar spoke again. There is something else you should know. Theodore did not move. Speak. Edgar's eyes shifted toward Lillian with visible hesitation. The night of the fire. His voice roughened slightly. The woman who brought you to us said one thing before she disappeared. Lillian felt her pulse begin hammering again. What? Edgar swallowed carefully. She said the child was never supposed to survive Blackmere Hall. Silence crashed through the room like shattered glass. Theodore went completely still in front of her. Not calm now. Not controlled. Still in the terrifying way predators became still immediately before violence. And for the first time since arriving at Blackmere Hall, Lillian truly understood how dangerous Theodore Ravenshade could become when someone threatened her. The silence after Edgar's final words felt almost alive, heavy enough to press against the walls of the receiving room. Lillian stood frozen behind Theodore while rain streaked slowly across the tall windows overlooking the cliffs beyond Blackmere Hall. The child was never supposed to survive. The sentence echoed through her mind again and again with terrifying clarity. Theodore had not moved since Edgar spoke. Not visibly. Yet something about the stillness surrounding him changed completely. The controlled restraint she had watched him maintain for days now no longer resembled calmness. It resembled containment. Edgar seemed to realize it too because genuine fear entered his face for the first time since arriving at the estate. Theodore finally spoke without turning around. Leave. The single word landed quietly. Far more frightening than shouting would have been. Edgar swallowed visibly. Your Grace, I did not come here to threaten. Leave, Theodore repeated. Still calm. Still terrifyingly soft. The guards at the doorway straightened immediately. Edgar looked toward Lillian desperately. You need to understand I was trying to keep you alive. Lillian stared at him through the blur of shock pressing against her thoughts. By stealing my life? Edgar flinched slightly. Theodore's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly beside her. You do not speak to her again, he said quietly. Not without my permission. Edgar's face drained further of color. You cannot control her future. Theodore finally turned then. Slowly. The cold fury in his expression stole the remaining air from the room instantly. Watch me. Edgar stepped backward instinctively. Not because Theodore raised his voice. Because something absolute lived inside his eyes now. Something merciless. The guards moved forward immediately afterward and escorted Edgar from the receiving room without further resistance. Lillian barely registered the sound of the doors closing behind them. Her thoughts had narrowed entirely around one horrifying truth. Someone wanted Eleanor Vale dead 20 years ago. Not missing. Dead. Theodore remained motionless near the center of the room for several long seconds after Edgar disappeared. Then slowly, carefully, he turned back toward her. The fury vanished from his face immediately upon seeing her. Not entirely, but enough. Lillian. She shook her head once before he could continue. No, her voice trembled softly now despite every effort to steady it. No more half-truths. Theodore's expression tightened faintly. I have told you everything I know. Then tell me what you suspect. Silence followed. Lillian crossed slowly toward the fireplace because suddenly standing still felt impossible. Her pulse hammered unevenly beneath her ribs while fragments of memory and fear collided painfully inside her mind. Theodore watched her carefully from across the room. You believe someone caused the fire? She whispered. Theodore did not answer immediately. Yes. And you believe they wanted the Vale estate? Yes. Then why kill a child? Theodore looked away briefly toward the rain-dark windows before answering. Because dead heirs cannot reclaim fortunes. Cold moved sharply through her chest again. Theodore crossed slowly toward the sideboard near the fireplace and poured water into a crystal glass before offering it toward her. Lillian accepted it automatically. Their fingers brushed briefly. Warmth against cold. There is more, Theodore said quietly. Lillian looked up sharply. What? Theodore hesitated. The hesitation itself frightened her because Theodore rarely hesitated at all. The investigation after the fire was closed too quickly. Meaning? Theodore's jaw tightened faintly. Witness statements disappeared. Financial records vanished. By who? I never proved it. Frustration flashed suddenly through her chest. You keep saying that. Theodore's eyes lifted toward hers again. Because I refuse to lie to you. The anger faded almost immediately. That was the problem with Theodore. Even his worst truths felt cleaner than the lies she had lived with her entire life. Lillian looked down into the untouched water trembling faintly inside the glass. You searched 20 years with no proof. Theodore stepped closer. I had one thing. What? Silence stretched. Then quietly, you asked me once if stars could disappear forever. Lillian's breath caught softly. Theodore continued watching her with unbearable steadiness. You were standing outside the observatory behind Blackmere Hall. His voice lowered slightly. You were 5 years old. You hated thunderstorms. The glass nearly slipped from her fingers. A memory flickered violently across her mind then. Brief. Fragmented. Rain against enormous windows. A man laughing softly somewhere nearby. Herself wrapped in a dark blanket while staring upward through glass at a night sky filled with stars. Lillian inhaled sharply. Theodore saw it immediately. Every muscle in his body tightened. You remember something. She pressed one trembling hand against her temple. The memory vanished as quickly as it arrived, leaving only dizziness behind. I do not know. Theodore moved instinctively toward her before stopping himself halfway. The restraint nearly hurt to watch. It is all right. His voice had softened now. Do not force it. Lillian closed her eyes briefly. Another image flickered at the edge of memory. Pine trees. Smoke. Someone carrying her through darkness while shouting echoed far away. Then nothing again. Her knees weakened slightly. Theodore reached her before she fully lost balance. His hands settled carefully around her arms, steadying rather than restraining. Easy. The word brushed softly through the room. Lillian opened her eyes slowly. Theodore stood painfully close now, close enough for her to see exhaustion beneath his controlled expression, close enough to notice the fear he hid so carefully from everyone else. Not fear for himself, for her. You really thought I was dead, she whispered. Theodore's hands tightened faintly against her sleeves. Every winter, he admitted quietly, I returned to the lake after the snow thawed because part of me believed they missed something. The confession settled heavily between them, raw in a way Theodore rarely allowed himself to be. That is why you never restored the East Observatory. His eyes sharpened slightly with surprise. Mrs. Norwood told you about it. Only that certain parts of the manor remained closed after the fire. Theodore released her slowly, then stepped back as though remembering himself. The loss of warmth felt strangely immediate. The observatory burned first, he said quietly. My father died trying to reach you. Silence filled the room once more. Lillian stared at him while something painful unfolded slowly inside her chest. Theodore had spent 20 years carrying grief for a child everyone else believed dead. 20 years searching, waiting, refusing to let go. And somehow she had walked into a ballroom in Charleston believing herself invisible while he recognized her instantly. "Why did you not tell me in Boston?" she asked softly. Theodore looked toward the fireplace. "Because you smiled." Confusion crossed her face. Theodore's jaw tightened faintly before continuing. "You looked peaceful for the first time since I found you." His voice lowered further. "I could not destroy that without certainty." The room became unbearably quiet after that. Lillian looked at him carefully then. Really looked. Theodore Ravenshade had not bought her in Charleston because he wanted possession. He had walked into that ballroom because he saw someone humiliating the girl he had spent half his life trying to save. The realization moved through her slowly, deeply. "Theodore." He lifted his eyes toward her immediately at the sound of his name. "Not Your Grace. Theodore. Always immediate." Lillian's throat tightened unexpectedly. "Why did you say it was overdue?" Theodore went still. "What?" "At the ballroom." Her voice softened. "You said paying for me was overdue." Something vulnerable flickered across his expression before he buried it again beneath control. "Because I should have found you sooner." The answer shattered the final distance between them far more effectively than any declaration could have. Lillian stared at him while the storm darkened outside Blackmere Hall once more and understood suddenly that Theodore's obsession had never truly been about the Vale fortune or unfinished investigations. It had always been about guilt. 20 years of guilt. 20 years believing he failed to save her. Before she could speak again, sharp knocking echoed suddenly through the receiving room doors. Urgent. Mrs. Norwood entered immediately afterward, visibly breathless for the first time since Lillian met her. "Your Grace." Theodore straightened instantly. "What happened?" Mrs. Norwood's face had gone pale beneath the corridor light. "The South Gate guards found a car abandoned near the forest road." Theodore's expression hardened. "And?" Mrs. Norwood swallowed carefully. "There was blood inside the vehicle." Silence crashed through the room again. Lillian felt Theodore's attention sharpen instantly beside her. "Whose car?" Mrs. Norwood looked toward Lillian briefly before answering. Edgar Valecrest never reached the main road. The storm returned before sunset. Heavy clouds rolled across the mountains surrounding Blackmere Hall, while cold rain hammered against the manor windows hard enough to shake the glass. The estate had changed completely within the span of an hour. Guards moved through every corridor now with quiet urgency. Lanterns burned along the cliffs and forest roads below the property. The gates remained locked, and somewhere beyond the rain-dark woods surrounding the estate, Edgar Valecrest had vanished. Lillian stood beside the tall windows of the East Library watching distant lantern lights move through the storm below. Theodore had ordered her to remain inside the manor while search parties combed the forest roads leading away from Blackmere. She understood the reason. That did not make the waiting easier. Behind her, the library fire crackled softly beneath heavy silence. Theodore stood near the desk across the room reading through reports delivered by guards every 15 minutes. He had not removed his coat since the search began. Rainwater still darkened the shoulders from his earlier ride through the estate grounds. Lillian noticed details now she would have missed days ago. The exhaustion beneath his eyes. The dangerous precision in every movement. The way servants spoke more quietly whenever he entered a room during moments like this. Theodore Ravenshade did not become louder under pressure. He became colder. "You should sit down." His voice broke through the silence without lifting from the papers in his hands. Lillian remained near the windows. "I am not tired." Theodore finally looked toward her. "You have been standing there for almost an hour." She folded her arms tighter across herself without answering. Outside, lightning flashed briefly beyond the cliffs, illuminating rain and pine forests in silver-white light before darkness swallowed them again. Theodore watched her quietly for several seconds before setting the reports aside. "Lillian." She turned slowly toward him. The concern in his expression almost hurt to look at now because it remained so carefully restrained. "If Edgar is dead because he came here—" "No," the answer came immediately. "Absolute." Theodore crossed the room toward her in measured steps. "This is not your fault." Lillian let out a faint, humorless breath. "Everyone keeps saying that when terrible things happen." Theodore stopped a few feet away. That does not make it less true. Silence stretched between them while rain battered the windows behind her. Lillian looked down briefly toward her hands. Part of me still wants him to be alive. Theodore's expression softened almost imperceptibly. I know. Even after everything. I know. The gentleness in his voice nearly undid her. Lillian looked away quickly toward the storm outside. I do not understand how someone can lie for 20 years. Theodore stood beside her near the windows now. Close enough that warmth drifted faintly from his coat despite the cold air surrounding the glass. Fear changes people. Is that what happened to him? Theodore remained silent for a moment too long. Partly. Lightning flashed again beyond the lake. This time closer. The thunder followed almost immediately afterward, deep enough to vibrate softly through the floor beneath them. Lillian flinched before she could stop herself. Theodore noticed instantly. He always noticed. You still hate storms. The words escaped him quietly. More memory than observation. Lillian looked toward him sharply. Theodore's eyes remained fixed on the rain outside. When you were little, you used to hide in the observatory whenever thunder started. His voice lowered slightly. You said storms sounded like the sky breaking apart. Another fragment flickered suddenly across her mind. Herself curled beneath a blanket beside enormous windows while distant thunder rolled beyond dark pine trees. A boy sitting nearby reading aloud because he knew she hated silence during storms. Lillian inhaled sharply. Theodore turned toward her immediately. What is it? I saw something. The tension in his posture became visible instantly. What? She pressed one trembling hand lightly against her temple. The observatory. Theodore went completely still beside her. You remember it. Only pieces. Her voice softened. There was someone reading to me. Silence crashed softly between them. Theodore looked away first toward the storm-dark windows. That was me. The simplicity of the answer tightened something painfully inside her chest. Lillian studied him carefully then. Theodore Ravenshade had spent 20 years carrying the memory of a child, while she remembered almost nothing at all. Yet somehow he never once sounded resentful about it. Only tired. The library doors opened suddenly before either of them spoke again. Mrs. Norwood entered quickly, her expression pale beneath the corridor light. Theodore straightened immediately. What happened? Mrs. Norwood looked toward Lillian briefly before answering. They found him. Silence fell instantly. Lillian felt her pulse stumble sharply. Theodore's voice remained calm. Alive. Mrs. Norwood nodded once. Barely conscious near the lower forest road. Relief and dread collided painfully inside Lillian's chest at the same time. Theodore's jaw tightened faintly. Bring the doctor. Already done. Mrs. Norwood hesitated before adding carefully. He keeps asking for Miss Valecrest. Theodore's expression darkened immediately. No, Lillian looked toward him. Theodore. No, his voice remained quiet but final. You are not going near him until I understand what happened. He could die. Something sharp flickered across Theodore's face then. Not jealousy. Fear. Real fear. That may be exactly why someone left him alive. The realization settled coldly through the room. Mrs. Norwood looked between them silently before withdrawing again. Theodore turned back toward the windows once the doors closed. Rain streamed heavily down the glass beside him while thunder rolled beyond the cliffs once more. He was attacked because of me? Lillian whispered. Theodore faced her immediately. No. This all started after you found me. Theodore crossed toward her then, closer than before. No, he repeated softly. This started 20 years ago. Silence stretched between them while stormlight flickered through the library in pale silver flashes. Lillian looked up at him slowly. You still think I am in danger? Theodore held her gaze steadily. I know you are. The certainty in his voice frightened her because Theodore rarely spoke without absolute conviction. Then why stay? She whispered before she could stop herself. Theodore's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. What? If finding me brought all of this back? Her throat tightened softly. Why did you not walk away? Theodore stared at her as though the question itself wounded him somehow. Rain hammered against the windows around them while the fire burned low behind his shadow. Because I spent 20 years searching for you. His voice had gone dangerously quiet now. And because the moment I walked into that ballroom and saw them humiliating you... He stopped suddenly. The control returned almost visibly across his face. Lillian waited. Theodore looked down briefly before finishing anyway. I realized I would destroy anyone who tried to take you from me again. The confession settled through the room like thunder itself. Raw, unfiltered, more honest than anything he had said before. Lillian's breath caught softly. Theodore seemed to realize exactly what he revealed because he stepped back immediately afterward, distance returning between them once more. You should rest tonight, he said calmly, though strain lingered beneath the words now. Tomorrow we will decide how to proceed. He turned slightly toward the desk as though intending to leave the conversation there. Theodore. He stopped instantly at the sound of his name. Lillian moved toward him slowly across the library, while stormlight flickered through the windows behind them. Theodore remained perfectly still, though tension became visible in every line of his posture. Look at me. He did. The exhaustion in his eyes nearly broke her heart. 20 years. 20 years searching for someone everyone else believed dead. 20 years carrying guilt heavy enough to hollow a man from the inside. And still he looked at her like she mattered more than his own survival. Lillian reached for his hand before she could lose courage. Theodore's breath caught almost invisibly the moment her fingers touched his. Warmth moved sharply through her chest at the contact. You found me, she whispered. The storm seemed to fade around them for one suspended moment. Theodore stared down at her hand wrapped carefully around his, as though he did not entirely trust the reality of it. Then slowly, with a restraint that somehow felt more intimate than desperation ever could, he turned his hand and held hers back. Lillian saw it then. Not the Duke. Not the terrifying man capable of freezing entire rooms with silence alone. Just Theodore. Tired. Relentless. Human. No, he said softly. His eyes lifted toward hers with something dangerously vulnerable beneath the control. You survived long enough for me to reach you, and for the first time since arriving at Blackmere Hall, Lillian realized she was no longer afraid of the man who claimed her in that ballroom. She was afraid of how impossible it had become to imagine leaving him.